When the Almighty announced to the angels the creation of man, they asked, "Will you place upon the earth those who will shed blood and spread corruption?" Allah answered, "I know what you do not know." Thousands of years later, in Babylon, a fire was lit to burn a man who had refused to bow before idols. And while that man sat in the flames and prayed, the angels watched from the heavens and finally understood what the Almighty had meant. The story of the Prophet Ibrahim is the answer to that very first question ever put to Allah. And that answer is addressed to every one of us. Chapter 1. The Man They Burned Alive. Picture a fire that birds flew around. Literally, they changed course in the sky, veering away hundreds of meters out. The flames rose so high that the only way to watch was from a distance, shielding your face with your hand. The heat was so dense that the air above the pyre trembled like a living thing. Those who witnessed it gave the fire a name, the Lesser Hell. It was not an exaggeration. And at the center of that fire sat a man, sitting quietly, praying, for days. His name was Ibrahim, peace be upon him, a prophet, second in rank only to Muhammad, may Allah bless him and grant him peace. A man his own people had condemned to be burned because he had shattered their gods with an axe. And here is what is most astonishing about this story. When the flames enclosed him on every side, when heat that could melt stone touched his skin, nothing. The fire became cool for him, safe, like shade on a summer afternoon. The people stood around and watched, saw it with their own eyes, and could not understand a single thing. But the textbooks tell only half of this story. They speak of the miracle and fall silent. They describe what happened on the outside while saying nothing about what happened within, about why this particular man ended up in the fire, about the choice he made in the last second before falling into the flames, about how that choice altered something far greater than the fate of one person. Because the story of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, is a story about the nature of faith, about what happens when a human being surrenders himself to the Almighty completely, without remainder, about what fire becomes when there is more room inside you for Allah than there is for fear. Let us begin at the beginning. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, lived among people who worshipped idols, stone ones, wooden ones, draped in gold and cloth. People brought offerings, prostrated themselves before them, placed their hopes in them. It was the norm. It was tradition. It had been so long and so deeply embedded that to question it seemed like madness. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, questioned it. He called his people to monotheism, patiently, persistently, again and again. They listened. They argued with him. They laughed at him. They threatened him. He continued. Then he did something they did not see coming at all. One day, while the people had gone to celebrate, Ibrahim, peace be upon him, took an axe and walked into the temple of the idols. He smashed them one by one, all of them except the largest. Then he hung the axe around the neck of the one that remained and walked out. When the people returned and found the destruction, their first thought was that the great idol had done it. Then they remembered Ibrahim. Then they summoned him. And that was when what ended in fire began. They debated his punishment. They hauled firewood from across the entire region. They built a pyre and gave it a name. They built a catapult to hurl the man into the flames from a safe distance, because approaching it themselves was physically impossible. Before he was launched into the fire, the angel Jibril, peace be upon him, came to Ibrahim, peace be upon him, with a question. Did he need help? Ibrahim, peace be upon him, refused. This decision is one of the most staggering in the entire history of the prophets. A man is flying toward fire. An angel extends his hand, and the prophet says, "No." Why? The answer to that question overturns everything one is accustomed to thinking about strength, about faith, and about what it truly means to trust the Almighty. But that is the next chapter. Chapter 2. The Refusal of Help. There is a question theologians have been asking for thousands of years. Why did the Almighty permit the fire at all? Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was a prophet, chosen, a man whom Allah called his friend, Khalilullah, the only prophet ever granted that title in his lifetime. The Almighty could have stopped the crowd before the pyre was ever built, could have turned the hearts of his people, could have scattered them the way wind scatters dust. He is all-powerful. That was never in question. But the fire was lit. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was thrown into it by catapult. There was no other way. People could not physically get any closer. The heat drove them back before they could take a step. The pyre they had built so carefully, hauling wood from across the entire region, was a work of rage and fear in equal measure. They feared this man, feared his words, his logic, his composure in the face of their fury. The fire was meant to destroy what they could not refute. And that was when Jibril, peace be upon him, appeared. The angel entrusted by the Almighty with revelation, the messenger between heaven and earth. He came to Ibrahim, peace be upon him, at the moment the catapult was already drawn back, when the air around trembled with heat, when the crowd had gone still in anticipation. Jibril, peace be upon him, asked, "Was there a need for help?" Ibrahim, peace be upon him, said, "No." This answer cannot be understood from the standpoint of ordinary human logic. Before you is a fire they named the lesser hell. Behind you is a crowd that wants your death. Beside you is an angel offering his hand. Any rational person would have taken that hand without a second thought. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, refused, because his heart was so filled with something that there remained no room in it for any support other than Allah. This is called Tawakkul, absolute reliance on the Almighty, complete surrender of oneself into his hands, a state in which a person stops dividing the world into "it helped" and "it didn't help," into "it saved" and "it didn't save," because he sees only Allah. Everything else becomes an instrument in his hands, not an independent force. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, refused the angel's help, but he received something greater, the presence of the Almighty within the fire. And the fire became cool. That word, cool, is the word the Quran uses precisely. The Almighty commanded the fire to be cold and safe for Ibrahim. The fire obeyed. Nature obeyed. Because nature too is a creation of Allah and possesses no power he did not grant it. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, remained in that fire for several days. Several days, at the center of what his people had called the lesser hell. He prayed, he prostrated, he existed in a state of peace that no laws of physics can account for. The crowd outside watched and did not understand. They had waited for screams. There were none. They had waited for the smell of burning. The air remained clean. They had waited for the moment the flames would swallow him, and he simply sat in the fire as though in a garden. But behind this miracle lay something that is rarely spoken of directly. The Almighty was not merely saving his prophet. He was answering a question asked long ago, long before Ibrahim, peace be upon him, had even entered the world. A question asked by the angels themselves, the very question that became the starting point of the entire history of human beings on earth. When the Almighty announced the creation of Adam and his descendants, the angels were troubled. Their question was direct and honest. Will you place there one who will spread corruption and shed blood, while we glorify your praise and sanctify you? Allah answered, truly, I know what you do not know. It was an answer without proof, a statement without demonstration, a promise whose confirmation had yet to be shown to the world. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, in the fire, that was the proof. The Almighty was showing the angels, look at my servant, look at how he worships me in a fire the like of which you have never seen. Look at how, among those you called spreaders of corruption, there are those who choose me, under any circumstances. Not because it is easy for them, because there is no room in their hearts for anything but me. Truly, I know what you do not know. This phrase received its living confirmation in the body of a man sitting in the flames. The angels watched, and in that watching lies yet another dimension, the one spoken of in the hadith narrated by Abu Huraira, may Allah be pleased with him. Angels who alternate among people through the night and day meet at the dawn and afternoon prayers. When they ascend to the heavens, the Almighty asks them, and He knows the answer better than they do. In what state did you leave my servants? The angels answer, we left them while they were praying, and when we came to them, they were praying as well. The Almighty asks, knowing the answer. He asks so that the testimony may be spoken aloud, so that the angels themselves pronounce what they have seen with their own eyes. This is the same mechanism as in the story of Ibrahim, peace be upon him. Allah sent Jibril, peace be upon him, to the prophet in the fire. Sent him so the angel would see, so he would return and tell, so that what happened in those flames would become a living answer to the question asked at the beginning of time. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, sat in the fire and prayed, and without knowing it, provided the answer to the most fundamental question about the nature of the human being. But the people outside saw only the fire, saw that he was not burning, saw the miracle, and still refused to understand. Because a miracle without a prepared heart remains merely a spectacle, inexplicable, unnerving, but changing nothing within. The crowd dispersed, life went on, and Ibrahim, peace be upon him, walked out of the fire, whole, calm, carrying not the smell of smoke, but the particular peace that belongs to a person who has passed through the heaviest trial imaginable and discovered that there is more inside him than he had ever known. The fire had tested him and confirmed what the Almighty had known from the very beginning. This is why the story of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, is not simply a story about a miracle. It is a story about how Allah knew His servant long before the servant knew this about himself. And in that knowledge, a lesson for everyone who reads these lines. Chapter 3. The question asked before the world was created. There is a moment that theologians call the beginning of beginnings. Before Adam was created, before the earth took its present form, before the first human word was spoken, the Almighty announced to the angels His decision to place on the earth His vicegerents, human beings. The angels responded with a question. They had witnessed everything that transpired in the universe, observed the order of the heavens, the motion of worlds, the flawless harmony of creation. And when the Almighty announced humanity, beings endowed with free will, capable of choosing, the angels asked directly, will you place there one who will spread corruption and shed blood, while we glorify your praise and sanctify you? It was an honest question. Not rebellion, not doubt in the Almighty, simply incomprehension. The logic of the angels was impeccable from their vantage point. Why create a being that destroys when beings that only glorify already exist? The Almighty answered with a single sentence, truly, I know what you do not know. No explanation, no arguments, simply, I know. The angels accepted the answer, they always accept, but the question remains suspended in space, without visible proof, without demonstration, only a promise. Centuries passed, people appeared on earth. The first, Adam and Hawa, peace be upon them. Then their descendants, then the descendants of descendants. The world filled with voices, cities, disputes, wars, prayers, betrayals, sacrifices. The angels observed all of this every day, alternating with each other, as described in the hadith of Abu Huraira, may Allah be pleased with him. Angels who are among you at night are succeeded by those who are among you during the day, meeting at the dawn and afternoon prayers. They saw much, saw the corruption they had asked about, saw blood, saw cities destroying one another, saw peoples forgetting everything they had been given. But the Almighty continued asking them, knowing the answer better than they did, in what state did you leave my servants? And the angels answered, "We left them while they were praying, and when we came to them, they were praying as well." Among people there were those who prayed, always, in every era, in spite of everything. And then Ibrahim, peace be upon him, appeared. He was born into a world where idol worship was so habitual that it seemed part of the fabric of reality itself. Stone gods stood in temples, draped in cloth and gold. Priests tended them. The people brought offerings. The system functioned, not because it was true, but because it was old. And everything old seems unshakable. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, had watched this since childhood. And he saw something the others did not notice: emptiness. Stone is stone. Wood is wood. Not one of these idols had ever heard a prayer, answered a request, or shielded anyone from harm. They simply stood there, mute, cold, lifeless. He began saying this aloud, first at home, then in the streets, then wherever anyone would listen. He called people to monotheism with a patience that was itself a kind of miracle. His people argued, rejected, mocked. The priests saw in him a threat. The rulers saw danger. Then he did what he did. The axe, the temple, the shattered idols. One survivor, with the axe around its neck. When the people returned from their celebration and found the destruction, the first impulse was bewilderment, then fury. They summoned Ibrahim, peace be upon him, to judgment. Asked, "Was it you who did this to our gods?" He answered in a way that left them without a response. He pointed to the great idol. "It has the axe around its neck. Ask it." They went silent. Then they said what people always say when logic reaches a dead end. "You know perfectly well it cannot speak." That was precisely what Ibrahim, peace be upon him, wanted to hear. They had pronounced judgment on themselves, admitted that they worship something that cannot speak, cannot hear, cannot see, said it aloud, and continued anyway. Because habit is stronger than logic. Because tradition is stronger than evidence. Because the fear of change is stronger than the fear of being wrong. They sentenced Ibrahim, peace be upon him, to death. The pyre took several days to build. Wood was hauled in from across the entire region. The fire they lit was so immense that the very sky above it looked different, murky, shimmering with heat. Birds skirted the place entirely. People stood at a distance and watched the work of their hands with that particular expression that belongs to a crowd that has convinced itself of its own righteousness. And here, at this point between the catapult and the fire, something occurred that is rarely spoken of in full. Jibril, peace be upon him, came to Ibrahim, peace be upon him, with a question about help. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, refused. He said, "It is enough for me that the Almighty knows everything about me better than I could ever express in a request." These words are not merely a beautiful phrase. They represent a theological position of extraordinary precision. The man is saying to the Almighty, "You know me better than I know myself. You know what I need better than I can formulate it. My request would be smaller than your knowledge of me. So I do not ask. I simply entrust myself to you." This is the very tawakkul that makes fire cool. But behind Ibrahim's refusal lies yet another level, the one that links his story to the question the angels asked at the beginning of time. When Jibril, peace be upon him, came to the prophet, it was a message to the angels. The Almighty was sending his witnessing messenger. Watch what is happening. Remember, this is my servant. This is what I meant when I answered your question. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was flying into the fire. And in that flight, in the space between the sky and the flames, he did not cry out, did not beg for rescue, did not negotiate terms with the Almighty. He was calm, absolutely calm, because his heart was so filled with love for Allah that fear simply found no place in it. Fear requires space. Love of that magnitude leaves it none. This is precisely why Allah named Ibrahim, peace be upon him, Khalilullah, his intimate friend. Khalil is not merely friend in the ordinary sense. The word shares its root with penetration. The love of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, for Allah had penetrated every part of his being. It had displaced everything else. What remained was singular, pure, complete, unmixed. Such a man in fire is proof, living, burning, irrefutable. The angels received their answer, not in words, but in the body of a prophet sitting in the flames and praying, "Truly, I know what you do not know." This phrase had ceased to be merely a promise. It had become visible reality. But the people outside saw only the fire, and that gap between what was unfolding in the heavenly dimension and what the people on earth could see is the central tragedy of this story. The greatest testimony ever given about the nature of the human being was playing out directly before their eyes. They watched and continued to understand nothing. Chapter 4. What those who watched saw. The crowd stood in silence. That particular silence, the kind that settles over people when reality refuses to conform to their understanding of the world. They had expected screams, the smell of burning flesh, a spectacle that would confirm their righteousness and close the question once and for all. Instead, a man in fire, alive, praying, calm. Someone in the crowd turned away first, then a few others. The spectacle that was supposed to strengthen their faith in the idols was doing precisely the opposite. It called everything into question, and that question could not be destroyed because they themselves had witnessed it. But most remained standing, watching, drawing no conclusions from what they saw. This is what is more astonishing about this story than the fire itself. The miracle was public, completely open. Hundreds of people witnessed it simultaneously. A man in flames that caused him no harm. This was a reality available to any eye. It could not be dismissed as rumor. No one could say someone had invented it. It was here, before them, within a few dozen meters. And still, most walked away unchanged. Because a miracle by itself changes nothing in a person who watches it with a closed heart. A miracle is not an argument for the mind. It is a testimony for the heart. And the heart opens only when the person himself desires it. When he is willing to receive what he has seen as guidance, rather than as a puzzle to be explained within the framework of a worldview he is not prepared to abandon. The priests most likely found an explanation, they always do. Magic, deception, illusion, conspiracy, anything as long as it was not the obvious. Meanwhile, Ibrahim, peace be upon him, sat in the fire for several more days. Several days, that is an important detail that is often overlooked. This was not an instantaneous miracle that could be dismissed as coincidence. It was a prolonged, unhurried presence in fire. Day after day, prayer after prayer, prostration after prostration. The fire burned and continued to be cool and safe for him. What was happening inside that fire, no one outside could know. No one heard his prayers. No one could see the expression on his face closely enough to describe it. No eyewitness accounts of this have survived, only what tradition has carried across the centuries. But there is something that can be understood by logic. A man who had refused the help of an angel because his heart was turned entirely toward Allah continued inside the fire doing precisely what he had done his entire life. He prayed. He remembered the Almighty. He was with him, in that state of presence that Sufi theologians would later call mushahada, the uninterrupted contemplation of the Almighty with the heart. For Ibrahim, peace be upon him, the fire was simply a new location for what he had always done. The external circumstances had changed radically. The internal state had remained the same. That is the key. The Almighty did not alter the fire. He commanded it to become cool. These are different things. The fire continued to burn. For everyone else, it remained fire. But for Ibrahim, peace be upon him, its nature was changed. Because between him and the fire stood something greater. the presence of the one who had created both the fire and the man and the laws by which one acts upon the other. Creation obeys its creator, always. This is Tawhid, monotheism, in its most direct, physical expression. The fire did not consume the prophet, because fire is not an independent force. It is only an instrument, and the one in whose hands that instrument rests commanded it to behave differently. When Ibrahim, peace be upon him, emerged from the pyre, the people saw him whole, without a single mark of fire on him. Tradition holds that even the ropes with which he had been bound before the throw were burned away, while he himself remained unharmed. The fire had dutifully consumed only what had kept him bound. It freed him and stopped. This was a second miracle inside the first. But let us return to those who stood outside. Among the crowd were different people. Most were those who had simply come to watch. They were drawn by spectacle, as people are drawn to any spectacle. They left with what they had brought, only now with a story to tell in the marketplace. There were the priests, those who had made a decision and could not reverse it without losing everything they were. Authority rests on infallibility. To admit error is to destroy the system that gives you standing. They saw the miracle and chose their standing. There were the rulers, those for whom Ibrahim, peace be upon him, posed a threat not theological but political. Monotheism is dangerous to those who themselves claim to be something more than merely one human being with power over others. They saw everything as well. They also chose. And there were a handful, those in whose hearts something shifted, those who stood at the pyre and felt that the old picture of the world no longer held, but the new one had not yet taken shape. These people carried a question away with them, and that question worked inside them long after the fire had gone out. History does not record their names, but they existed. They always exist, in any crowd, in any era. People in whom a miracle lands in an already prepared place. People who had been waiting for it, without knowing it themselves. Prophets always speak for them, for that handful whose hearts are already standing at the threshold, and who need only one final push. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, provided that push. Through fire, through his composure in the fire, through his emergence from it, alive, whole, free. He walked out of the flames and continued his mission. Because the fire was a trial, not the end of a road. Rather, its confirmation. The point at which everything he had believed received its visible embodiment. His people, for the most part, stayed with their idols, and he moved on, carrying what he carried. To new cities, to new people, through new trials. Because the mission of a prophet is not confined to one city or one fire. It lives in every heart that is still capable of hearing. And in that, the final lesson hiding behind the smoke of this fire. A miracle is not the goal. A miracle is testimony. And testimony exists for those who are prepared to receive it. For all others, no fire will help. No miracle. No prophet. Only one's own choice. The very choice for the sake of which the Almighty placed human beings on earth, knowing who they would become long before the angels asked their question. Chapter 5. A lesson that has not aged. There is a question people ask in every era. Why does the Almighty permit suffering? Why does a sincerely believing person end up in fire, literally or otherwise? Why does righteousness not protect from pain? Why does prayer sometimes feel like a cry into emptiness? The story of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, answers this question. Not in words, in events. Not in theory, in the body of a man sitting in flames and remaining alive. But the answer demands attention. It is layered. And the first layer is the most uncomfortable. The trial was necessary, not because the Almighty did not know what Ibrahim, peace be upon him, was capable of. Allah knew everything, before the pyre, before the axe, before the first word the prophet ever spoke to his people about monotheism. The trial was not necessary for him. It was necessary for Ibrahim, peace be upon him, himself, for his people, for the angels, for all the people who would come after, in 10 years, in 100, across thousands. The Almighty does not send trials to learn the outcome. He sends them so the outcome becomes visible for those who need to see it. This is the first lesson. When life throws a person into fire, into illness, into loss, into injustice, into loneliness, it does not mean the Almighty has turned away. It means something is happening whose significance extends beyond what can be seen. Something that cannot be understood from the outside. Something that will become clear, perhaps later, perhaps in an entirely different dimension. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, knew this, which is why he was calm. But knowing is not enough. Knowledge must become a state, a living texture of relationship with the Almighty that holds not because everything is fine, but because, always, under any circumstances. This state is what is called Tawakkul. Much is said about it. It is rarely understood. Tawakkul is not passivity. It is not sit and wait for everything to resolve itself. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, acted. He smashed the idols. He told his people the truth to their faces. He refused the angels' help. That too was action, a conscious choice. Tawakkul is active reliance. A person does what is within his power and entrusts the outcome to the one who governs everything. The difference between tawakkul and ordinary human calculation lies in the point of support. An ordinary person relies on the outcome. He makes an effort and waits for a specific result. If the result is different, he concludes the effort was wasted. His faith in the rightness of his actions depends on what emerged at the end. A person with tawakkul relies on the Almighty. He makes an effort and releases, because he knows, Allah knows better what outcome is needed, even if that outcome is fire. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, did not know in advance that the fire would become cool. He could not have known. He entered that unknown with complete reliance on the one who governs both fire and man, and the fire obeyed. The second lesson lies in what happens to a person inside the trial. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, prayed inside the fire. This is a specific, concrete detail that tradition preserved intentionally. He prayed, he worshipped, he behaved inside the fire exactly as he had behaved before it. This is the mark of genuine faith, not the kind that functions only in calm conditions, but the kind that remains itself under any circumstances. That external fire cannot alter, because something else is burning inside and burns brighter. Sufi theologians said, "A person is known through trial the way gold is known through fire, not because the fire creates new qualities in him, but because the fire burns away everything extraneous, and what remains is only what was real from the very beginning." The fire revealed the true Ibrahim, peace be upon him, the one the Almighty had known long before the pyre. The third lesson is the most personal. It is addressed to every person who reads this story and recognizes something of themselves in it. When the devil catches you in the net of troubles, as the Prophet Ibrahim was cast into the fire, and asks, "Is there something you need?" Answer, "I have no need. I need only Allah." And when he says, "Then ask." Answer, "It is enough for me that the Almighty knows everything about me better than I could ever express in a request." This is direct guidance, not an abstract principle. Specific words for a specific moment, the one when fire is already all around and no exit is visible. What happens after these words? The fire of worldly trials will become coolness in safety, and Allah will grant His mercy. This sounds like a promise, because it is a promise, given not by one human being to another, given by the Almighty through the example of His prophet, an example that stands firmer than any words precisely because it was lived through in a real fire by a real man. But one thing must be understood here. Coolness does not necessarily mean the disappearance of fire. The fire of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, continued to burn. It did not go anywhere. Everyone around could see it. It was real. But for the one inside it, its nature had changed. Pain remained on the outside, peace within. This is how faith operates inside a trial. It does not always remove the circumstances. It changes what happens inside the person within those circumstances. The illness may remain, but the anxiety departs. The loss remains, but the despair departs. The injustice remains, but the feeling of abandonment departs. Because the person knows, he sees, he is near. The fourth lesson concerns what happens when a person moves away from this knowledge. When a person distances himself from religion, the help of the Almighty is delayed. This is not punishment, it is natural consequence. Help travels along lines of connection, and when the connection is severed, the signal cannot get through. Prayer is connection. Reliance is connection. Trust in the Almighty during a trial is connection. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, prayed inside the fire. The connection was open, maximally open, and help arrived, in a form he himself could not have anticipated. Not an angel, not rescue before the fire, but coolness inside the fire itself. The Almighty always answers, but the form of the answer is His. And accepting that form, even when it bears no resemblance to what was expected, is also part of Tawakkul, perhaps its most demanding part. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, did not tell the Almighty, "Save me in this way and no other." He simply surrendered, completely, without conditions, and received an answer that surpassed anything he could have asked for. The people outside kept standing, watching, without understanding, and inside the fire, a man who understood everything. Not because he was more intelligent, because his heart was somewhere else, in the place that fear cannot reach, that fire cannot touch, where only Allah, Khalilullah, the friend of Allah, not merely a title granted for merit, a description of a state, when love for the Almighty has penetrated every part of one's being and left no room for anything that could displace it. The fire tested that state and confirmed it. This lesson is alive. It has not aged by a single day across all the millennia that have passed, because fire, in one form or another, comes to everyone. And in that moment, everyone faces the same choice that Ibrahim, peace be upon him, faced between the catapult and the flames. To take the outstretched hand, or to say, "You are enough for me." This decision is made in a fraction of a second, but it is prepared across an entire lifetime. Chapter 6. What remains after the fire? The pyre went out. The wood that had been hauled from across the entire region over several days turned to ash. The fire they had named the lesser hell extinguished itself the way any fire does, when what fed it runs out. The crowd dispersed. The priests returned to the temples. The rulers returned to their palaces. The life of the city settled back into its accustomed course. The idols that had survived kept standing. Ibrahim, peace be upon him, left. He continued his mission in other cities, among other people, through other trials. The fire was not the end of his story, but its midpoint. Ahead lay wanderings, separation from those he loved, new trials, each of which was its own particular fire. Leaving his wife and son in a waterless desert, the command to sacrifice his own child. A life in which trials did not end, they only changed their form. And each one he passed through in the same way, with complete reliance on the Almighty, without calculating the outcome, without bargaining with Allah over terms, without trying to govern what lay beyond his power. This is precisely why the Almighty called him Khalil, his intimate friend. Not for sinlessness, not for outward righteousness without flaw, for the state of a heart in which there was no room for anything but Allah. Now, what this story means today, thousands of years have passed. The world has changed beyond recognition. Those temples with their stone idols no longer exist. Those priests no longer exist. That pyre no longer exists. But there is something that has not changed at all. The human being. His inner architecture, the same. The same fears, the same temptations. The same pull towards something visible, tangible, reliable by the standards of ordinary logic. And that same deep capacity to choose differently, to choose reliance over calculation, to choose Allah over the outstretched hand that seems closer. Every person, in the course of their life, stands before their own fire. It looks different each time. Sometimes, like an illness that arrives without warning and refuses to leave for months. Sometimes, like a loss after which the world seems to have folded in half. Sometimes, like an injustice that can neither be corrected nor understood. Sometimes, like a loneliness so dense it feels physical. The devil stands nearby in that moment, always, asking the same question he has always asked. Is there something you need? Is there someone you can turn to? Is there a way out? This one, the obvious one, the human one, without all this patience and reliance. The answer of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, has been carried across the centuries for precisely this moment. I have no need. I need only Allah. It is enough for me that the Almighty knows everything about me better than I could ever express in a request. This is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength available to a human being. A strength that does not depend on circumstances, that cannot be taken away, broken, or burned, because it rests not on the external, but on what is within, on the connection with the one who created both the fire and the person and all the space between them. When a person speaks these words sincerely, something changes. The Almighty commands the fire to become cool. He does not necessarily remove it, but he alters its nature in relation to this person. The pain remains, but the anxiety departs. The hardship remains, but the despair departs. The fire remains, but it burns differently, or does not burn at all. The Almighty gave the prophets and messengers, peace be upon them, guidance for precisely these situations in life. This guidance is not beautiful words for peaceful days. It is the consecrated way out, shown to us through those who pass through the heaviest trials imaginable. To the degree a person follows it, to that degree he receives mercy and attains safety. It works, but it works only for those who are willing to trust completely. Here is what is most astonishing about the conclusion of this story. The people of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, spent several days building the pyre, poured into it their strength, their time, their resources, created what seemed to them to be absolute destruction. They were certain of the outcome, so certain they gave the fire a name in advance. And all of it turned out to be coolness. For one man, for that one single person who looked not at the fire, but through it, toward the one who governs both the fire and everything else. This is the ending that turns the story upside down. Not the victory of an army, not a political upheaval, not the public humiliation of priests. Simply, a man walked out of a fire alive and calm. And that was enough. Enough to answer the question the angels asked before the creation of the world. Enough to become an example for every person who would come after. Enough for the Almighty to call this man his friend. Allah does not need great numbers. One genuine person is enough for him. The story of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, is a story about that one. About how one person with an open heart weighs more than 1,000 with closed ones. How one prayer in fire means more than 1,000 prayers in safety if behind them there is no reliance that makes them alive. The Almighty told the angels, "Truly, I know what you do not know." Ibrahim, peace be upon him, in the fire became the living proof of those words. The fire went out. The idols eventually vanished. Time did what the people had refused to do. The priests dissolved into obscurity along with their explanations. The rulers who pronounced the sentence are forgotten. And the name of Ibrahim, peace be upon him, is spoken every day by billions of people in every prayer, in every language, on every continent. The man they threw into fire to make him fall silent still speaks. This is the answer to the question about the nature of real strength. Fire does not conquer the one within whom is Allah.